If you want to constantly knock your enemies down and never allow them to move while constantly landing huge charged two-handed attacks, then this is the build for you. This build is incredibly powerful in what I believe is the strongest stagger build in the entire game. Your enemies will not be allowed to move while you absolutely slam them with huge attacks. Let's jump right into the early game. In character creation, the most obvious choice is the Lords of Fortune. They give a decent boost to stagger builds, and that is what this build is all about. Lords of Fortune is without a doubt the best faction to choose, but it is also without a doubt the worst for story reasons. So I recommend against choosing them and choosing whatever faction interests you the most. Warriors have the best early game in the game. However, for this build, I leaned into the two-handed aspect of it, because if you're choosing this specialization, I'm going to assume you want to smash things with a two-hander. So with that being said, it is slightly worse than going with the sword and shield in the early game. So if you want the strongest first 20 levels possible, I recommend checking out my champion build early game, and then respeccing once you unlock specialization. The primary spells in the early game will be Titan Stomp, Driving Kick, and Spectral Bulwark. Titan Stomp works very well with our stagger build early on, as it deals very high stagger damage in a large area of effect. It also applies Overwhelm, and most importantly, it does not use Rage, and instead has a cooldown, allowing us to use Rage for our other abilities. Driving Kick is the starter ability and is the only Rage ability we use early on, which makes it our primary ability. It only costs 1 Rage, so it is very spammable and very useful to knock high health enemies off edges in the early game. It's also maybe the most fun and satisfying ability to use in the game once you land a super nice kick. Spectral Bulwark is chosen pretty much just for the fact that it does not cost Rage, allowing us to use Driving Kick on cooldown. It's not my favorite ability because I really just do not value defense very much in this game, but in the early game, it's alright. You should really just be dodging or blocking, but it's not a bad ability to use for free. For the early game important passes for this build, we first have Downfall, which is very nice. It guarantees us a critical hit if the target is knocked down. They will be knocked down quite a lot because that's what this entire build is about, is knocking enemies down. So getting a guaranteed crit, especially in the early game, is very strong. Next up we have another ability that works very well with Downfall, which is Blunt Force. Enemies are knocked down when their armor breaks. This happens extremely often, obviously, as there are tons of armored enemies in the game. So you knock them down with this passive, jump attack them with Downfall, and guarantee yourself criticals. For our last early game important passive, this might be the most important passive in the entire game for Slayer, is Rolling Thunder. You're going to want to make sure after you land a heavy attack to quickly land another heavy attack to basically get a much quicker attack. It's very hard if you just sit there and do very slow heavy attacks to actually do significant damage to enemies or significant stagger to them. So you're going to want to make sure to get your attack combos down in this build to land quicker attacks. For the early game equipment, I recommend just experimenting and trying out whatever weapons and armor you would like. Equip whatever items give the biggest damage boost. Now after level 20, we enter the mid to late game and we will be acquiring the Slayer specialization. And now we will also equip Whirlwind and replace Driving Kick. Whirlwind is the same ability it is in every single game ever. If you are a traditional warrior player and building into Slayer, it's very likely that this ability is one of the reasons why. This build uses it to the maximum. You spin in a circle, dealing high damage and stagger with a massive final attack. It's not really a win now button like it is in some certain other games, but it is a decent ability and it is decently fun to use as well. Deadly Duration fits in very nicely with this build, as it is an area-based build. I've used this ability in every single one of my warrior builds because it's just a very nice glue ability. It's never going to be the shining star of the build, but it does help get some advantages going and deals decent damage in an area of effect. Titan Stomp returns once again for the late game. Alongside Deadly Duration, this is probably my favorite warrior ability in the game. Much like Deadly Duration, this ability is not the star of the build, but it does provide us with very solid CC, area damage, and acts as a good vehicle to give us additional advantages. For Golden Glory is a super cool ultimate, flying up in the air and dive bombing enemies for absolutely massive AoE damage is one of, if not the most satisfying ultimates in the entire game. For our late game important passives, there really isn't that many important ones to know, but like I mentioned with the passive earlier, it's very important to know your attack combos to make your attacks much quicker. Which brings us to Arc of Destruction. After a sprint attack, use a light attack or heavy attack to follow up with an additional final attack. It's very important to know this. It's very simple, but it's important to know all of your attack combos to land your attacks quicker in this build. For our equipment, we're going to start with weapons, the Executioner's Blade. This gives us more charged attack damage and gives us more stagger dealt by charged attacks, which we do very, very often. For our shield, we are just running the Captain's Heater. This just gives us more defense and more weapon damage by the sum of all of our resistances. This is just generally the best shield in the game, and it also provides very high amounts of stagger. For our weapon of choice that we will be using is the Anvil Breaker. This provides us with more stagger damage, more damage with our charged heavy attacks, and a longer staggered duration. For our helmet, I decided to run with a more unique option. This provides us with a ton of stagger damage and takedown damage. And the final passive on it basically ensures that we have our ultimate up almost at all times. And the ultimate on this build is super fun to use, which is an added bonus. For armor piece, I decided to go back to the basics and go with the Garb of Kinship. Hands down the best armor piece in the game. All the other ones aren't even very interesting, they are just strictly worse. In every situation, the Garb of Kinship is the best armor piece you can have, so we are putting it on this build. For belt, we're going with the Hard Bitten Belt. This pretty much just gives us an extra 25% takedown damage and 50% staggered duration, which is obviously pretty nice in a stagger build. Once enemies are staggered, they actually take a ton of damage from takedown damage with this build. For our amulet, we're going with the Miner's Talisman, as every single one of the abilities we have is area ability based. So this just gives us more rage, more damage, more stagger, everything we want. For our rings, we're going with the Call of the Hall unique ring, which you get from the Hall of Valor pretty early on in the game. This ring is very strong early on. I recommend rushing it right away. More stagger, more takedown damage, and it gives us a random advantage, which obviously loops in with our Garb of Kinship. For our second ring, we're going with the Amaranthine Loop, as this gives us, again, more stagger, more takedown, win all around. For our runes, we are going with my favorite rune, Vivify. This rune is pretty much the go-to on every build ever. If you're ever in doubt, just grab Vivify. I have seen people wondering where to get Vivify. Vivify is acquired towards the end of the mission in Weishaupt, so make sure you do not miss it. If you do, I have also heard that you can acquire it in the Black Emporium later on. For our next rune, we are going with Daze. This is pretty much just for the passive stagger. You definitely can use the active effect on it, probably to greater effect than Vivify in this build, but Vivify is just basically good all the time, whereas Daze, you might need to switch to it, it's more niche. For our last rune, we're going with Pierce. This one is 100% just for the penetration damage. Pretty much always use the active on either Vivify or Daze, whichever one you want in the moment. For companions, there really is only one super great choice for this build, and that is Harding. Harding gives more stagger for the build, which no other companions really do as far as I know. This bow in particular gives us more stagger damage. Her other armor pieces just have nice things like team-wide penetration, and her trinket also gives us precision. For abilities, I like to run enhanced damage a lot. Well, adrenaline rush rather. It gives us enhanced damage. I like to use this on all of my rogues. Why not? More damage is always very nice. And as always with all my companions, I always run the ability that they auto-use, because why not? It's just more abilities. Which is for her Shred, which happens to apply Sundered and deal a high amount of stagger. For her last ability, I use this one because it deals a very high amount of stagger. For our second companion, it's really completely up to you on what companion you use. between Nev, Emmerich, and Balara. As long as you're using a mage, it doesn't really matter what your choice is. For this playthrough, I did decide to go with Nev because her CC and freezing is pretty much invaluable to the team. And I pretty much use Balara and Emmerich in every single one of my other builds, so I decided to change it up a little bit and go with Nev for this one. For playstyle, I like to spam abilities and heavy attacks to gather up stagger on enemies until you can take them down, which deals huge damage. Even if an enemy is already low, I heavily recommend that you take them down instead of outright killing them to get some additional passive benefits from takedowns. There really isn't any special combo with this build, it's pretty much just brute force, Oonga Boonga, heavy attacking down enemies until they fall over. As a reminder, there is a link in the description to a full level by level guide. Let me know what you think about the build in the comments down below, and please click the like button if this video was helpful. Thank you all very much for watching, and I will see you all next time.